Humans have been engaged in combat since the beginning of time. And while we've gotten really good at offing people in very creative ways, we didn't start with nuclear bombs and hypersonic missiles. So here are a bunch of insanely weird weapons actually used in World War II you were never told about. The Great Panjandrum, Britain's rocket-powered wheel of death that was supposed to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Two 10-foot wooden wheels connected by a drum stuffed with 4,000 pounds of explosives, propelled by 70 cordite rockets strapped to the rims, screaming across a beach at 60 miles per hour. The idea: roll this bad boy straight into Nazi concrete fortifications and blow them to kingdom come during D-Day. By 1944, the whole project was scrapped, and D-Day planners went with, actual tanks that didn't try to murder their own side. But if you think a runaway explosive wheel is bad, wait until you hear about the weapon that used live animals as suicide bombers, and I'm not talking about dogs. The Bat Bomb. It's 1943, and a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle Adams has just pitched President Roosevelt the most unhinged idea of the entire war. Take thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats, strap tiny napalm bombs to them, cool them down until they hibernate, load them into a bomb casing with over 1,000 little compartments, drop the whole thing from a B-25 bomber over Japan at dawn, and let the bats wake up, scatter across a 20 to 40 mile radius, roost in attics and eaves like they naturally do, and then boom ignite an entire city made of wood and paper. The US military looked at this plan and said, you know what? Let's fund it. $2 million and multiple test runs later, the Bat Bomb accidentally burned down a US Army airfield in Carlsbad, New Mexico, because some bats escaped and decided the general's car and a hangar looked like prime real estate. The kicker? In controlled tests, it actually worked at an 80% fire start rate, potential for millions of simultaneous blazes across Japanese urban centers. But by 1944, the brass canceled it to focus on a different bomb, the atomic one, which frankly seems way less creative. The Bat Bomb's legacy? It inspired modern drone swarm technology and sparked decades of ethical debates about weaponizing animals, because apparently strapping explosives to sleeping mammals raises some questions. But animals with bombs weren't just an American thing, because the Soviets took it to a whole new level of tragic. Anti-tank dogs. The USSR trained dogs to run under enemy tanks with 10 to 12 kilograms of explosives strapped to their backs, using a lever detonator that would trigger when the dog dove beneath the armor. Sounds brutal? It gets worse. Soviet trainers starved the dogs, then fed them only under stationary Soviet tanks, conditioning them to associate the underside of tanks with food. The plan was simple: release hungry dogs on the battlefield. They sprint toward German panzers, thinking it's dinner time. Boom! Tank destroyed. Except in practice, these poor dogs had three massive problems. First, they were trained on Soviet diesel tanks, but German tanks ran on gasoline, so the dogs got confused by the smell and often ran toward their own side's vehicles instead. Second, the chaos of battle gunfire. Explosions, shouting terrified them, and many just bolted or cowered. Third, and this is the darkest part, German soldiers quickly learned to shoot the dogs on sight, and when that didn't work, they started using flamethrowers. The Soviets claimed these dogs destroyed 300 German tanks, but German records and historical analyses suggest the real number was around 40-50, and some dogs reportedly returned to Soviet lines, causing explosions and casualties among friendly forces. By 1943, the program was quietly shelved, though it left a permanent stain on military ethics and became a symbol of how desperate the Eastern Front got. The whole thing inspired debates that eventually led to international bans on using animals in combat. But that cold comfort doesn't help the hundreds of dogs that died in the anti-tank program. Speaking of animals getting the short end of the stick, let's talk about the weapon that tried to turn pigeons into precision-guided missile systems. Project Pigeon. This project was later renamed Project Orcon, was psychologist B.F. Skinner's brainchild from 1940. Skinner, the guy famous for operant conditioning and those creepy Skinner boxes, figured he could train pigeons to guide missiles by pecking at a screen. Here's how it worked. Inside the nose cone of a missile, you'd have 3 pigeons in separate compartments, each facing a screen displaying the target image as the missile flew. The pigeons were trained to peck at the target on the screen, and their pecks would adjust servo controls to steer the missile toward the target in real time. In lab tests, it actually achieved 80% accuracy, which is genuinely impressive for 1943 technology. Skinner got $25,000 in funding and built working prototypes with pigeons that could correct course mid-flight. But when he demonstrated it to military officials, they looked at him like he'd grown a second head. The whole concept felt too absurd, too unreliable, and by 1944, electronic guidance systems were advancing fast enough that the military pulled the plug. The project was declassified in the 1950s, and Skinner spent years defending it, arguing that biological computers were ahead of their time. He wasn't entirely wrong. Project Pigeon was a precursor to modern smart weapons, and even influenced early AI research into behavioral algorithms. But let's be real, the mental image of three pigeons frantically pecking screens while a missile screams toward a target at hundreds of miles per hour is pure nightmare fuel mixed with slapstick comedy. It's the kind of thing you'd see in a Monty Python sketch, except it was a serious, funded military program. Now, if you think using live animals is weird, wait until you hear about the weapon that used dead ones: explosive rats. In 1941, Britain's Special Operations Executive, the shadowy spy agency Churchill set up to set Europe ablaze, came up with a sabotage tool so disgusting it's almost genius. Take a dead rat, gut it, stuff the skin with plastic explosives and a time pencil fuse, sew it back up, and smuggle it into Nazi-occupied territory. The idea was that resistance fighters, or SOE agents, would place these rat corpses near coal piles in factories or train depots, and when workers shoveled coal into boilers, they'd unknowingly toss in the rat, which would explode inside the furnace, causing catastrophic damage to the machinery. The SOE produced about 100 of these things and shipped them to occupied France in 1942. But here's the twist. The Gestapo intercepted the shipment before a single rat bomb was ever used in combat. The Nazis were so paranoid about it that they launched a massive search operation, tearing apart factories and rail yards looking for exploding rodents that didn't even exist in the field yet. The psychological impact was huge. German forces wasted countless hours inspecting every dead rat they found, tying up resources and manpower. The explosive rat became more effective as a weapon of paranoia than as an actual bomb. Declassified SOE files from the 1990s confirmed that the program was considered a success purely because of the chaos it caused without ever detonating. And honestly, that's peak British spycraft. Win the war by making Nazis afraid of dead rats. But if you want to talk about psychological warfare mixed with actual destruction, we need to discuss Japan's attempt to weaponize the jet stream itself. Fugo balloon bombs. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched roughly 9,000 hydrogen balloons carrying incendiary and high-explosive bombs across the Pacific Ocean, riding the newly discovered jet stream to reach the continental United States and Canada. These balloons were 33 feet in diameter, made from mulberry paper glued together by Japanese schoolgirls in factories, and equipped with an ingenious altitude control system. Sandbags dropped automatically to maintain height, and when the balloon descended over North America, it would release its payload and self-destruct. The goal was to start massive forest fires, destroy infrastructure, and terrorize the American public. Out of those 9,000 balloons, about 300 reached North America, landing everywhere from Alaska to Mexico and as far east as Michigan. Most did nothing. They landed in remote areas or failed to ignite. But on May 5th, 1945, a balloon bomb killed 6 people in Oregon, a pregnant woman and 5 children on a church picnic who found the device and accidentally triggered it, making them the only civilian casualties from enemy action in the continental U.S. during World War II. The U.S. government imposed a media blackout to prevent panic and deny Japan any confirmation that the balloons were working, which actually succeeded. Japan assumed the program failed and canceled it. Declassified documents reveal the balloons cost Japan about $8 million, caused minimal damage, but could have been devastating if they'd targeted the right season for wildfires. Post-war analysis showed that if Japan had launched the campaign in late summer instead of winter, they might have ignited catastrophic fires across the Pacific Northwest. The Fugo bombs remain one of the first intercontinental weapons in history, and a chilling proof of concept for modern long-range terror attacks. Now, let's shift gears from balloons to something even more insane: Nazis' obsession with superweapons that sound like they're ripped from science fiction: the sun gun. In the 1920s, German rocket scientist Hermann Oberth, the guy who mentored Wernher von Braun, theorized about a space station equipped with a massive mirror to focus sunlight into a concentrated death ray. Fast forward to World War II, and Nazi engineers at the Hillersleben artillery range actually studied this concept as the Sonnengewehr, or sun gun. The idea was to build a 9-kilometer wide mirror in orbit, about 5,000 miles above Earth, and use it to incinerate entire cities or boil oceans by focusing sunlight into a beam hot enough to ignite anything. Documents captured after the war showed German scientists estimated it would take 50 to 100 years to build, require launching thousands of tons of material into space, and cost an unimaginable fortune. Needless to say, it never progressed past theoretical sketches and calculations. But here's the thing: the sun gun wasn't just Nazi Nazi fever dream material. Oberth's concept was inspired by ancient legends of Archimedes using mirrors to burn Roman ships during the siege of Syracuse, and modern physicists have confirmed that orbital mirrors could theoretically focus enough solar energy to cause localized damage, though nothing like the apocalyptic weapon Germany envisioned. The sun gun became a symbol of Nazi Wunderwaffen, propaganda wonder weapons that promised to turn the tide of the war, but existed mostly to boost morale as the Reich crumbled. It influenced Cold War space weapon research, including Reagan's Star Wars program, and remains a staple of alternate history fiction. But in World War II, it was vaporware, literally. Speaking of vaporware, let's talk about a weapon that almost got built but was so absurd it makes the sun gun look practical: Project Habakkuk. In 1942, British inventor Geoffrey Pike proposed building an aircraft carrier out of ice. Not regular ice, but pykrete, a mixture of ice and wood pulp that's as strong as concrete and nearly unsinkable because it's buoyant and melts incredibly slowly. The idea was to construct a 2 million-ton floating fortress, 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to serve as a refueling base for planes hunting German U-boats. Winston Churchill loved it and ordered a prototype built on Patricia Lake in Alberta, Canada. The test model, a 60-foot scaled-down version, actually worked. It was so insulated, it took 3 years to fully melt, even after refrigeration was turned off. Engineers calculated the full-size Habakkuk would require 8,000 workers 2 years to build, cost $70 million, and need constant refrigeration powered by onboard engines. But as the project advanced, 3 fatal problems emerged. First, the Allies developed long-range bombers and escort carriers that made mid-Atlantic bases obsolete. Second, the amount of steel and resources needed for refrigeration equipment could build multiple conventional carriers. Third, and most hilariously, nobody could figure out how to steer a 2 million-ton iceberg ship without it just drifting wherever it wanted. By 1943, the project was canceled, and the Lake Patricia prototype was left to slowly melt into obscurity. Declassified files show that even Pike admitted the engineering challenges were insurmountable with 1940s technology. But the idea lives on. Pykrete's durability impressed scientists enough that modern Arctic researchers still study it for potential use in polar construction. So yeah, we almost had a giant ice aircraft carrier, and honestly, that would have been the most badass thing in naval history. But if you think a floating ice fortress is impractical, wait until you meet the weapon that tried to shoot around corners: the Krummlauf, German for curved barrel. This was an attachment for the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, a bent barrel with a periscope sight that lets soldiers shoot around corners without exposing themselves. The Nazis developed it for urban warfare and tank crews who needed to defend against infantry without opening hatches. There were 2 main versions, a 30-degree bend for infantry and a 90-degree bend for tanks. In theory, it's genius. In practice, it was a disaster. Bullets don't like being forced to turn sharp corners at high velocity. The friction and stress caused barrels to warp after about 300 rounds. Bullets fragmented inside the curve, reducing range and accuracy to almost nothing, and the rifle's recoil became unpredictable and dangerous. Testing showed the effective range dropped from 300 meters to about 35 meters, and the barrel's lifespan was so short that frontline troops called it useless. Still, a few thousand were manufactured in late 1944 and saw limited action during the Battle of Berlin, where desperate German soldiers used them in close-quarters street fighting. Post-war analysis confirmed that while the concept was innovative, the technology wasn't there, yet modern curved barrel weapons exist for bomb disposal robots and SWAT teams, but they use fiber optics and engineered barrel materials that didn't exist in World War II. The Krummlauf remains a fascinating example of Nazi throwing everything at the wall in the final years, hoping something would stick. Spoiler, a bent rifle barrel wasn't it. Now, let's talk about remote-controlled death on tracks, because the Germans also pioneered that. The Goliath tracked mine. This little guy looked like a tiny tank about 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 1 foot tall, but it was actually a remote-controlled demolition vehicle, loaded with 60 to 100 kilograms of explosives. German engineers developed it after capturing French prototypes in 1940, and by 1942, they were deploying it across Europe. The operator would guide the Goliath via a long cable toward a target, bunkers, tanks, bridges, whatever needed blowing up, and then detonate it remotely. Germany built over 7,000 of them in 2 variants, an early electric model that was cheap but slow, and a later petrol-powered version that was faster but more expensive. Sounds cool, right? Except the Goliath had massive flaws. The control cable was vulnerable. 1 bullet or shell fragment could sever it, leaving the Goliath dead in its tracks. It was slow, maxing out at about 6 miles per hour, so enemy troops could easily shoot it or run away. And it was a one-use weapon, so every deployment cost hundreds of Reichsmarks for what might be a single blown-up Jeep. Allied soldiers called them doodlebugs, and often captured them intact because the crew would abandon them when the cable got cut. Despite these issues, Goliath saw action in major battles like Anzio and Normandy. During D-Day, German forces tried using them against Allied beach positions, but most were destroyed or captured before reaching their targets. Post-war, military historians recognize the Goliath as the direct ancestor of modern unmanned ground vehicles and explosive ordnance disposal robots. So every time you see a bomb disposal bot on the news, you're looking at a great-great-grandkid of the Nazi doodlebug. But remote-controlled explosives weren't the only German innovation that sounds like it's from a video game. Hochdruckpumpe. This was a super gun designed to shell London from over 100 miles away, using a barrel 140 meters long that's almost 500 feet built into a hillside in Mimoyekes, France. The barrel had multiple side chambers that would fire secondary charges as the shell passed, accelerating it to insane velocities without needing a single massive explosion. Think of it like a railgun, but using staged explosives instead of electromagnets. Hitler was obsessed with it as part of his vengeance weapons program, alongside the V-1 buzz bomb and V-2 rocket. Construction began in 1943, with plans to fire 600 shells per hour at London, each carrying a 25-pound warhead. But the project hit roadblock after roadblock. The barrels kept wearing out from the immense pressures. Accuracy was abysmal. Test shots missed targets by miles. And in July 1944, the Royal Air Force got wind of it and sent Lancaster bombers with tallboy bunker buster bombs to obliterate the site. The raid collapsed the tunnels and destroyed most of the installation before the V-3 could fire a single shot at London. A smaller version was later deployed near Luxembourg and fired about 150 shells at Allied-held towns, causing minor damage and killing a handful of people before it was captured in February 1945. Post-war, engineers studied the multi-chamber design and found it was theoretically sound, but required materials and precision manufacturing beyond 1940's capability. Modern artillery researchers cite the V-3 as an early attempt at electromagnetic propulsion concepts that eventually led to railgun development in the 21st century. So Hitler's revenge supergun ended up being a proof of concept for Navy railguns 70 years later, which is kind of poetic. And speaking of weapons that sound too weird to be real, let's discuss the one that tried to shoot down planes with compressed air: the Windkanone. Developed by a German engineering firm in 1944, this anti-aircraft weapon used a massive combustion chamber to ignite a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen, creating a shockwave of compressed air that would supposedly disrupt aircraft engines or shatter their wings. The prototype was installed near an Elbe River bridge to defend against Allied bombers. It looked like a giant mortar tube angled toward the sky, and when fired, it produced a visible vortex of air with enough force to allegedly break wooden planks at 100 meters. The Nazis tested it against low-flying planes, and eyewitness accounts claim it shattered windows and knocked birds out of the sky. But there's zero evidence it ever actually damaged an aircraft. The problem? Air dissipates. By the time the shockwave reached bomber altitude, thousands of feet up, it was about as dangerous as a stiff breeze. Allied forces captured it in early 1945, tested it themselves, concluded it was useless, and scrapped it. Declassified intelligence reports describe it as an interesting scientific curiosity with no practical military value. But the concept wasn't entirely worthless. Modern non-lethal weapons research has explored acoustic and shockwave devices for crowd control, and the Windkanone is cited in some papers as an early, crude example. Still, trying to knock planes out of the sky with a puff of air might be the single most German over-engineered solution to a problem that already had a working answer. Just shoot the plane with bullets. Now, if you thought the Windkanone was a desperate last-ditch weapon, wait until you hear about Britain's attempt to turn the Blitz into a fireworks show gone wrong: the unrotated projectile. During the early Blitz in 1940, Britain was desperate for anti-aircraft defenses because German bombers were pounding cities nightly, and RAF fighters couldn't always intercept them. So the Royal Navy developed the UP, a ship-launched rocket that would deploy a parachute mine mid-air, creating a floating aerial minefield for bombers to fly into. Picture this: dozens of rockets fired from warships, each releasing a small bomb dangling from a parachute, filling the sky with explosives that would detonate on contact with aircraft. In theory, it's brilliant, cheap, easy to mass produce, and doesn't require precise aim. In practice, it was a nightmare. The parachutes made the mines highly visible, so pilots easily avoided them. The rockets were unguided and inaccurate, often missing entire formations. Worse, the mines would slowly drift with the wind, sometimes back over British ships, forcing crews to frantically maneuver to avoid their own ordnance. And the absolute worst part? The mines had a timer, so if they didn't hit anything, they'd eventually detonate in mid-air, raining shrapnel down on whatever was below, including British cities and ships. After a few months of tests and minimal success, the UP was quietly retired retired, and the Royal Navy went back to conventional anti-aircraft guns. Declassified Admiralty records show that UP rockets shot down maybe a handful of German planes, possibly by sheer luck, but caused more friendly fire scares than enemy casualties. The program's legacy? It proved that aerial minefields are a logistical and safety disaster, and it inspired exactly 0 future weapon systems, which is probably for the best. But Britain wasn't done with weird rocket ideas, because next up is a weapon that makes the UP look sane by comparison. The Ba 349 Natter. It was Nazi Germany's answer to the question nobody asked. What if we made a disposable rocket-powered fighter plane that launches vertically like a missile, and the pilot has to bail out mid-attack? Developed in late 1944 as bombers were obliterating German cities, the Natter was designed to intercept Allied bomber formations with minimal training and resources. Here's how it worked. Strap a pilot into a tiny rocket with a nose cone full of unguided rockets. Launch him straight up on a rail like a firework. Have him fly toward the bomber formation. Fire all his rockets in one salvo. Then eject while the Natter crashes or deploys a parachute for recovery. The Natter could hit 500 miles per hour and reach altitude in under a minute. Germany built 36 of them and conducted several unmanned tests, but only one manned test flight happened on March 1st, 1945. Test pilot Lothar Sieber launched. The canopy flew off 10 seconds in. The Natter went out of control, and Sieber died when it crashed. That was it. The program was canceled immediately, and the remaining Natters were either destroyed or captured by advancing Allied forces. Post-war analysis showed the concept was theoretically viable. Modern vertical launch interceptors prove that, but the technology was way ahead of its time, and the execution was reckless, even by desperate Nazi standards. Sieber's death made him the first person to die in a vertical rocket launch, a grim milestone in aerospace history. The Natter influenced Cold War surface-to-air missile development, and some of the captured prototypes ended up in American museums, where they remain as testaments to late war insanity. And finally, we've reached the absolute pinnacle of unhinged WW2 weapons, the one that makes everything else on this list look reasonable. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka. You know this thing's name had a literal translation as cherry blossom, but Allied forces called it the Baka bomb, ironically Japanese for idiot. This was a rocket-powered suicide plane designed for one purpose: obliterate American warships by kamikaze at 650 miles per hour. The Oka was essentially a manned cruise missile 20 feet long, carrying a 1,200 kilogram warhead in the nose, powered by 3 solid-fuel rockets, and piloted by a volunteer who had 0 chance of survival. The launch process was terrifying. A Mitsubishi G4M bomber would carry the Oka under its fuselage, fly within range of Allied ships, release it, and the pilot would glide toward the target before igniting the rockets for the final plunge. Japan built around 800 of them between 1944 and 1945, and they were used extensively during the Battle of Okinawa. The results? Mixed at best, horrifying at worst. American ships equipped with radar and massed anti-aircraft fire could shoot down the slow, lumbering bombers before they released their Okas, and even when released, many Okas were intercepted before reaching their targets, but the ones that got through were devastating. Their speed made them nearly impossible to stop, and the massive warhead could cripple or sink a destroyer. The destroyer USS Manert El Abele was the first ship sunk by an Oka on April 12, 1945, killing about 80 sailors. Records show 55 Oka pilots died in combat, but they only successfully sank or damaged about a dozen ships, making the exchange rate pretty terrible even by kamikaze standards. The program ended with Japan's surrender, and post-war, the Oka became a symbol of Japan's desperation and the human cost of fanaticism. But here's the dark twist. American engineers studied captured Okas and incorporated the rocket boost concept into early guided missile designs, meaning this suicide weapon indirectly influenced modern anti-ship missiles. So every time you see a Harpoon or Exocet missile in action, there's a tiny, messed up lineage, going back to Japanese pilots strapping themselves to rockets and diving into warships. These 15 weapons represent the absolute outer limits of World War II innovation, where desperation, ingenuity, and sometimes pure madness collided to create tools of war that range from tragic to absurd to genuinely terrifying. From Britain's runaway explosive wheels to Japan's human-guided cruise missiles, every one of these weapons tells a story about how far nations will go when survival is on the line. Some, like the Bat Bomb and Goliath, left legacies in modern military technology: drones, robots, smart weapons. Others, like the Sun Gun and Wind Cannon, were pure fantasy technology dressed up as engineering projects, and a few, like the anti-tank dogs and Oka, stand as reminders of war's darkest ethical compromises, where living beings became expendable components in machines of destruction. What's wild is that most of these weapons didn't change the war's outcome. The Allies won through industrial might, intelligence, and conventional arms, not through bats or pigeons or ice carriers. But these oddities show us something crucial about human nature. When pushed to the brink, we'll try anything, no matter how insane, because the alternative is surrender. And maybe that's the real legacy of WW2's weirdest weapons. They prove that innovation doesn't always mean progress, and creativity in war often comes with a body count. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen.